forearms trembled as the transport ship lurched through hyperspace. Her pale blue skin had turned almost white with fear, and the delicate gills along her neck fluttered rapidly as she struggled to breathe. The metal shackles around her wrists and ankles bit into her flesh, leaving angry purple marks that would never heal properly. She was a species known throughout the galaxy for their incredible capacity to feel pain. What would barely register as discomfort to most beings felt like agony to her kind. It was both a blessing and a curse that had shaped their entire civilization. They had developed the most advanced medical technology in known space because they had to. Every minor injury was a catastrophe that demanded immediate attention. But now, that same sensitivity that had driven her people to greatness was about to become her doom. The slave trader, a massive with hide and cruel yellow eyes, stomped through the cargo hold where dozens of captured beings huddled in terror. His heavy boots rang against the metal floor like funeral bells. When he stopped in front of his cage, she pressed herself against the far wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. "This one's special," he growled to his assistant, a wiry with too many teeth. "Pain amplifiers in her nervous system make everything hurt 50 times more than normal. The fighting pits on Nexus Station will pay a fortune for her." The assistant licked his lips with a forked tongue. "The spectators love watching the sensitive ones break. How long do you think she'll last?" "Minutes, maybe less," the trader laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "These are soft, beautiful to look at, but they shatter like glass the moment you touch them wrong. The crowds eat it up." Understood every word through the universal translator embedded in her skull. She had learned the common tongue years ago when she worked as a medical researcher on the peaceful world of Ashanti Prime. That life felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else entirely. 3 cycles ago, raiders had attacked her research station. They came without warning, plasma cannons blazing, tearing through the facility's defenses like paper. Had been in the middle of a breakthrough on neural regeneration therapy when the alarms began screaming. She remembered running through smoke-filled corridors, her sensitive hearing overwhelmed by the sounds of destruction, her skin burning from the acrid fumes. She almost made it to the escape pods, almost. A stun blast had dropped her just meters from safety. When she woke up, she was here, in this nightmare of metal and despair. The trader moved on to inspect other captives, but his words echoed in her mind. Fighting pits, pain for entertainment. Her people's greatest weakness turned into a spectacle for the amusement of monsters. In the cage next to hers, an elderly male looked at her with eyes full of sympathy. His own species was known for their incredible resilience, able to shrug off injuries that would kill most beings. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "I'm sorry, young one," he whispered in heavily accented common. "I've heard of Nexus Station, what they do there to your kind. It isn't right." Nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She had heard the stories too. Nexus Station was a lawless hub in the Outer Rim where the worst criminals in the galaxy gathered. The fighting pits were just one of many horrific attractions designed to feed the appetite of beings who had long ago abandoned any pretense of civilization. The ship shuddered again, and she knew they were dropping out of hyperspace. Through the small porthole in her cage, she could see the ugly sprawl of Nexus Station growing larger. It looked like a massive tumor against the stars, all twisted metal and flickering lights. Ships of every size and configuration swarmed around it like carrion birds. Her 4 hands clenched into fists. They were not a warrior species. They had never needed to be. Their incredible medical knowledge made them valuable allies, and their peaceful nature meant they rarely made enemies. But they were also gentle, perhaps too gentle for a galaxy that seemed to reward only cruelty and violence. Closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, singing the ancient lullabies of there. The memory was bittersweet now, knowing she would never hear that voice again. Her family believed her dead. The raiders had destroyed all evidence of survivors, selling their captives into the black market slave trade that flourished in the galaxy's dark corners. The transport ship docked with a series of mechanical clanks and hisses. Moments later, the cargo bay doors opened with a grinding screech that made sensitive hearing feel like needles were being driven into her skull. She pressed her hands over her pointed ears, but it did little to help. Armed guards in battered armor began herding the captives out of their cages. When they reached, one of them, a human with dead eyes and a face full of scars, grabbed her roughly by the arm. The contact was Agony. Her nervous system, designed to detect the slightest injury or illness, interpreted even gentle touch as potential threat. But this was not gentle. The guard's grip was like molten metal against her skin, and she couldn't stop the cry of pain that escaped her lips. The guard grinned at her reaction. "Sensitive little thing, aren't you? Don't worry, sweetheart. Where you're going, you'll get used to pain real quick, or you'll die. Either way works for us." They marched the captives through the station's corridors, and his eyes widened in horror at what she saw. Nexus Station was everything the stories had claimed and worse. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. Beings of every species imaginable crowded the walkways, most of them armed and all of them dangerous. In alcoves and side passages, she glimpsed scenes that made her stomach turn. Slaves being sold like livestock. Addicts huddled around glowing vials of illegal stimulants. Enforcers in blood-stained armor dragging away those who couldn't pay their debts. The fighting pits were in the station's lower levels, where the artificial gravity was heavier and the air was thick with the smell of blood and fear. The main arena was a circular depression surrounded by tiered seating that could hold thousands of spectators. The floor was stained dark with the blood of countless victims, and the walls were lined with weapons of every conceivable type. Was thrown into a holding cell beneath the arena floor, where dozens of other fighters waited their turn. Most were hardened criminals or professional gladiators, beings who had chosen this life or had been molded by it into killing machines. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Fresh meat," one of them, a hulking saurian with cybernetic implants, growled. "Look at this one, boys, soft as silk and twice as fragile. She'll last about 30 seconds in the pit." A few others laughed, but noticed that some of the fighters looked uncomfortable. Even in this place of violence and despair, there were those who still retained some shred of decency. An old Terran human sat in the corner of the cell, his weathered face creased with scars and his gray hair hanging in matted strands. Unlike the others, he didn't mock or threaten her. Instead, he watched her with curious eyes, as if trying to solve some puzzle. "What's your name, girl?" he asked quietly. She whispered, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. He replied. "Been fighting in these pits for longer than I care to remember, seen a lot of beings come and go." He paused, studying her with those strange, intelligent eyes. "But I've never seen them throw someone like you into the arena. Aren't you?" She nodded, wondering why this human was being kind to her. In her experience, humans were unpredictable. Some were gentle healers and scholars, while others were among the most vicious predators in the galaxy. This one seemed different somehow, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Thought so," said. "My squad served alongside some of your people during the Outer Rim conflicts. Bravest medics I ever saw, saved a lot of human lives." His voice grew harder. "What kind of monsters throw a healer into a fighting pit?" Before could answer, the cell door clanged open. A Nexus Station enforcer, his face hidden behind a tactical mask, pointed at her with a shock prod. "You're up, alien. Time to give the crowd a show." His legs nearly gave out as she stood. This was it. This was how her life would end, torn apart by some monster while thousands of beings cheered for her blood. She thought of her research, all the lives her work might have saved if she had been allowed to complete it. She thought of her family, who would never know what had happened to her. As the enforcer led her toward the arena entrance, she heard call out behind her. "Remember, girl, you're stronger than you think. Your people always are." The words followed her as she walked up the tunnel toward the arena floor, where the roar of the crowd grew louder with each step. The sound was like a physical force, pressing against her sensitive hearing like a wall of noise and hatred. The arena lights were blinding after the dimness of the holding cells. Thousands of beings filled the seats, all of them screaming for violence. Some threw bottles and debris into the pit, while others held up signs with crude pictures of wounded aliens. Stood alone in the center of the arena, her forearms wrapped around herself as she tried to block out the overwhelming sensory assault. Every light was too bright, every sound too loud, every smell too strong. Her nervous system was designed for the quiet, clean environment of there, not this cacophony of brutality. The arena master, a grotesquely obese-like being in a hovering platform, raised his arms for silence. His voice boomed through the arena's speakers, electronically amplified to painful levels. "Citizens of Nexus Station, tonight we have a special treat. Fresh from the core worlds, a delicate little flower for your amusement. This female will face our champion in single combat. Let's see how long she can last against the Reaper. The crowd erupted in cheers as a gate on the far side of the arena ground open. What emerged made blood freeze in her veins. The Reaper was a nightmare-given form. Once, it might have been a warrior, but cybernetic enhancement had transformed it into something inhuman. Its arms had been replaced with spinning blade assemblies that whirred menacingly. Its legs were augmented with hydraulic pistons that made each step shake the ground. Worst of all, its face had been removed entirely, replaced with a featureless metal mask that reflected the arena lights like a mirror. It stood 3 meters tall and moved with the fluid grace of a born killer. The crowd went wild as it raised its blade arms and spun them in complex patterns, creating a web of deadly metal that would reduce any normal being to ribbons in seconds. Knew she was about to die. Her people had no combat training, no warrior instincts. They were healers, not killers. Even if she had been armed with the best weapons in the galaxy, she wouldn't have known how to use them. The arena master was still speaking, but she could no longer make out the words over the roar of the crowd and the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. The Reaper began to advance, its blade arms spinning faster now, creating a high-pitched whine that cut through her skull like a knife. This was how it would end. Not in the peaceful research lab where she belonged, but in this pit of violence and hatred torn apart for the amusement of monsters. She closed her eyes and prepared for the agony she knew was coming. But then something unexpected happened. Another gate opened, and a new figure stepped into the arena. It was the old human from the holding cell, but he looked different now and more confident. In his hands he carried a simple plasma rifle, nothing fancy or advanced, just a standard infantry weapon that had seen better days. The crowd fell silent, confused by this turn of events. The arena master's voice crackled with irritation. "What is the meaning of this? Get that human out of there." But ignored the commands crackling from the speakers. Instead, he walked calmly to side and placed himself between her and the Reaper. "Easy there, big fellow," he said to the cyborg in a conversational tone. "I think there's been a mistake. This little lady isn't a fighter, she's a medic." The Reaper paused, its spinning blades slowing as it processed this unexpected development. Behind its featureless mask, whatever remained of its original consciousness seemed to be struggling with the situation. Kept his rifle pointed at the ground, not threatening but ready. His voice carried clearly across the arena as he spoke to the crowd. "I've been fighting in these pits for 15 years, killed more beings than I can count, all for your entertainment, but I draw the line at murdering innocents." He gestured toward with his free hand. "This woman is a healer. Her people have saved millions of lives across the galaxy, and you want to watch her die for sport." The crowd began to murmur, some shouting for the fight to continue while others seemed uncertain. The arena master was screaming orders, but the enforcers seemed reluctant to enter the pit while the Reaper was active. Turned slightly to look at, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Compassion. Real, genuine care for a being he barely knew. "Don't worry, Doc," he said quietly. "I've got a plan, but I need you to trust me." Before she could respond, the Reaper made its decision. The cyborg champion had been programmed to kill, and it didn't care about speeches or moral stands. It charged forward, blade arms spinning at full speed, ready to cut down both humans who dared to stand in its way. What happened next would change everything thought she knew about humans, about courage, and about the power of compassion in a galaxy that seemed to have forgotten what those things meant. Moved like lightning. Despite his age and the scars that marked his weathered body, he rolled to the side with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades fighting for survival. The Reaper's spinning blades carved through the air where he had been standing just moments before, sending sparks flying as they struck the arena floor. Watched in amazement as the old human came up from his roll in a perfect shooting stance. His plasma rifle barked once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. The bolt struck the Reaper's left arm assembly, and one of the spinning blade units exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The crowd roared its approval, but wasn't done. He sprinted across the arena floor, using the Reaper's momentary confusion to position himself behind one of the metal pillars that supported the arena's energy barriers. The cyborg spun around, trying to track him, but was already moving again. "Stay down and stay behind me," he called to over the noise. "Whatever happens, don't try to help, you'll just get in the way." The Reaper charged again, and this time stood his ground. At the last possible moment, he dropped into a slide that carried him between the cyborg's legs. As he passed underneath, he fired straight up into the creature's torso. The plasma bolt punched through its armor plating and into the power coupling that fed its remaining blade arm. Blue electricity arced across the Reaper's body as its systems overloaded. The spinning blade slowed and finally stopped, hanging useless at its sides. But the cyborg was far from finished. Its powerful legs were still functional, and it turned with surprising speed to deliver a kick that would have pulverized a normal human. Threw himself backward, but he wasn't quite fast enough. The Reaper's foot caught him in the ribs and sent him flying across the arena. He hit the wall with a sickening crack and slid to the ground, his rifle clattering away across the floor. Gasped and started forward, but raised a shaky hand to stop her. "I said stay back," he wheezed, blood running from the corner of his mouth. "This isn't over yet." The Reaper approached slowly now, savoring its apparent victory. Without its blade arms, it would have to kill them with its bare hands, and it seemed to relish the prospect. The crowd was going wild, screaming for blood and death. But wasn't finished either. As the cyborg loomed over him, he pulled something from his belt. It was small and round, about the size of his fist, with blinking lights around its circumference. "You know what the funny thing is about being a soldier for 40 years, said, loud enough for his voice to carry across the arena. "You learn that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become one yourself." He pulled the pin from the grenade and held it up for the Reaper to see. The cyborg froze, its remaining sensors analyzing the threat. "Thermal detonator," explained conversationally. "Military grade, enough explosive to level half this arena. But here's the thing about being old and tired and sick of watching innocents die for sport. I don't really care if I take this whole place with me." The arena had gone completely silent. Even the bloodthirsty crowd seemed to understand that things had taken a serious turn. The arena master was frantically shouting orders, but no one seemed willing to act. Struggled to his feet, the grenade still clutched in his hand. "Here's what's going to happen. The girl and I are going to walk out of here. Anyone who tries to stop us is going to find out what it feels like to be at ground zero of a military-grade explosion." The Reaper took a step back, its sensors screaming warnings about the weapon held. For all its cybernetic enhancement, it still retained enough of its original survival instincts to recognize a no-win scenario. "You're bluffing," the arena master's voice boomed through the speakers. "You won't kill yourself just to save one alien." Looked up at the creature in its hovering platform and saw something in his eyes that made her shiver. It was the look of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You want to test that theory?" he asked quietly. "I've been fighting in your pits for 15 years. 15 years of watching beings tear each other apart for your amusement. 15 years of being a monster so you could get rich off other people's pain." He held up the grenade again. "Maybe it's time for that to end." For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. It was the Reaper who broke the stalemate. The cyborg stepped aside, clearing a path to the arena exit. Whatever programming controlled, it had apparently calculated that allowing 2 prisoners to escape was preferable to being destroyed along with half the station. Smiled grimly and gestured for to join him. "Come on, Doc, time to go." Hurried to his side, her 4 hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. She could feel the hostile stares of thousands of beings boring into her back, but none of them dared to move while held that grenade. They walked slowly toward the exit, keeping the thermal detonator visible at all times. The crowd parted before them like water, no one willing to risk triggering an explosion that would kill hundreds of innocent bystanders along with the intended targets. As they reached the tunnel that led back to the holding cells, spoke without turning around. "Anyone who follows us dies. Anyone who tries to stop us dies. And if I hear that this arena has reopened for business any time in the next year, I'll be back with enough explosives to turn this whole section of the station into scrap metal." They disappeared into the tunnel, leaving behind an arena full of confused and angry spectators. The arena master was screaming into his communicator, demanding that security forces intercept them, but had chosen his route well. The tunnels beneath the fighting pits were a maze of maintenance corridors and abandoned storage areas that he had spent years exploring during his imprisonment. "This way," he whispered, leading through a narrow passage that connected to the station's water recycling system. "I've been planning this escape for months, just never had a good enough reason to risk it before." They crawled through pipes barely wide enough for a human, the sound of their breathing echoing off the metal walls. Behind them, could hear the distant sound of boots and shouting voices as the station's security forces began their search. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a larger maintenance bay, quickly sealed the entrance behind them, and activated a small device that would scramble any tracking sensors trying to follow their trail. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they figure out where we went," he said, checking the readout on his wrist communicator. "There's a cargo bay on level 7 that connects to the civilian docking ports. If we can get there, I know someone who might be willing to help us get off this station." Watched him work, marveling at the transformation she was witnessing. The broken old man from the holding cell was gone, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and confidence. This was what had been before his capture, she realized. A soldier, a protector, someone who had spent his life standing between innocents and those who would harm them. "Why?" she asked as they made their way through the station's service corridors. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Paused at an intersection, checking both directions before signaling for her to follow. "I told you, I served with your people during the Outer Rim conflicts, saw what they were willing to sacrifice to save others." He glanced back at her. "Besides, I've been looking for a way to hurt the people who run this place for a long time. Shutting down their main attraction and helping one of their victims escape seems like a good start." They climbed maintenance ladders and crawled through air vents, always staying ahead of the search parties that were combing the station for them. Seemed to know every shortcut and hidden passage, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent years planning for this moment. When they finally reached the cargo bay on level 7, was exhausted. Her physiology wasn't designed for this kind of physical exertion, and every muscle in her body was screaming in protest, but seemed tireless, driven by a purpose she was only beginning to understand. The cargo bay was full of shipping containers and industrial equipment. Led her to a concealed communications console and began typing rapidly. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Pick up the damn comm." The screen flickered to life, showing the face of a middle-aged human woman with short gray hair and intelligent eyes. She wore the uniform of a merchant captain, but something about her bearing suggested military training. She said, her voice tight with concern, "What the hell are you doing on Nexus Station? I thought you were dead." "Long story, and we don't have time for it now," replied quickly. "I need an extraction, 2 passengers, and we need to leave yesterday." The woman's eyes shifted too, and her expression softened slightly. "What's a healer doing in a place like this?" "Another long story," said. "Can you help us or not?" The woman was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the risks. "Bay 94, my ship is the Wandering Star. I can have the engines warmed up in 5 minutes, but you'll need to get there fast. Station security is going crazy looking for someone." "That would be us," admitted. "Thanks, I owe you one." "You owe me about 50, she replied with a grim smile. "But who's counting? Just get here in one piece." The screen went dark and began gathering supplies from the cargo bay. He found 2 workers' uniforms and a pair of identification badges that would get them through the civilian sections of the station. "Put this on," he told, handing her one of the uniforms. "Keep your head down and try to look like you belong here. We're maintenance workers doing a routine inspection. Nothing suspicious about that." Struggled into the oversized uniform, her 4 arms making the process awkward. Helped her adjust the fit and showed her how to activate the identification badge. "One more thing," he said, pulling a small medical kit from his pack. "This might hurt, but it's necessary." Before she could ask what he meant, he applied a dermal patch to her neck. The medication it contained would temporarily dull her hypersensitive nervous system, making her less vulnerable to the sensory overload that plagued her species in high-stress situations. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since her capture, could think clearly without being overwhelmed by every sound, smell, and sensation around her. "Better?" asked. She nodded, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. "How did you know?" "I told you I've worked with your people before, always carried emergency pain suppressors in case one of our medics got injured." He shouldered his pack. "Ready to get out of here." They made their way through the civilian levels of the station, moving with the practiced confidence of workers who had every right to be there. The identification badges got them through security checkpoints, and their uniforms made them effectively invisible to the crowds of travelers and merchants that filled the commercial areas. Bay 94 was in the older section of the station, where the docking facilities were less sophisticated but also less heavily monitored. The Wandering Star turned out to be a modified cargo hauler, its hull by years of hard use, but its engines humming with barely contained power. Was waiting for them at the airlock, her hand resting casually on the pistol at her hip. She looked exactly like what she was, a former military officer who had found a new life among the stars. "Welcome aboard," she said, sealing the airlock behind them. "Strap yourselves in. We're leaving now before station security figures out where you went." The ship's acceleration couch was like a cloud compared to the horrors had endured over the past few days. As the Wandering Star pulled away from Nexus Station and jumped into hyperspace, she finally allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive this nightmare. Sat beside her, tending to the injuries he had sustained in the arena. His ribs were cracked, and there was internal bleeding that would require medical attention, but he refused to let her help treat him. "Save your strength, Doc," he said. "You've been through enough." Joined them once the ship was safely in hyperspace. "So," she said, settling into a nearby chair, "want to tell me how you ended up in the fighting pits of Nexus Station?" Gave her a condensed version of events, leaving out most of the details about his own imprisonment. Listened in silence, her expression growing darker with each word. "Slavers," she said when he finished. "I hate slavers, bad for business and worse for the soul." She turned to, "Where do you want to go? I can drop you off at any of a dozen core worlds where the authorities actually give a damn about law and order." Thought about it for a moment. Her research station was gone, her work destroyed. Her family thought she was dead. She could start over somewhere else, find a new position, try to rebuild her life. But something had said kept echoing in her mind. He had been looking for a way to hurt the people who ran places like Nexus Station, people who profited from suffering and turned cruelty into entertainment. "I want to help," she said quietly. "There are others still trapped on that station, others who will be thrown into those pits to die for sport. I can't just walk away knowing that." Looked at her with something that might have been pride. "It's dangerous work," he warned, "and it doesn't pay well. Most people think we're criminals or terrorists." "We asked." Smiled for the first time since they had boarded her ship. "Welcome to the Underground Railroad, Doc. We've got a galaxy full of slaves to free and monsters to fight. Think you're up for it?" Looked at the two humans who had risked everything to save her life, who were offering her a chance to turn her nightmare into something meaningful. She thought about all the beings still trapped in the darkness, waiting for someone to show them that compassion and courage still existed in the galaxy. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." Outside the ship's viewports, the stars streamed by in brilliant lines of light as they raced toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Somewhere behind them, Nexus Station continued its grim business, but its hold on the darkness had been weakened. And in the depths of space, three unlikely allies began planning their next move in a war that most of the galaxy didn't even know was being fought. 6 months had passed since escape from Nexus Station, and the galaxy had begun to take notice of the Underground Railroad's activities. What had started as a small group of rebels operating from the shadows had grown into a network spanning dozens of worlds, united by a single purpose: to strike back at those who profited from suffering. The Wandering Star hung in space near the nebula, its hull now bristling with concealed weapons and advanced sensors. Had used her contacts in the legitimate shipping industry to transform her cargo hauler into a vessel capable of taking on much larger opponents. More importantly, she had recruited other ship captains who shared their cause. Stood in the ship's medical bay, treating injuries on a group of newly rescued slaves. Her 4 hands moved with practiced efficiency as she applied healing gel to laser burns and injected pain suppressors for the worst cases. The medical bay had been expanded and equipped with the most advanced healing technology available, making it one of the most capable trauma centers in the Outer Rim. Among the rescued beings was a young child who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His scales were dull with malnutrition, and his large eyes were filled with the kind of terror that no child should ever have to experience. knelt beside his treatment bed and spoke softly in his native language, words of comfort and reassurance that seemed to calm his trembling. "The nightmares will fade," she promised him. "You're safe now, we won't let anyone hurt you again." Appeared in the doorway, his own injuries from their latest rescue mission still healing. He had refused treatment again, claiming that others needed it more than he did. It was typical of the old soldier, always putting others first regardless of the cost to himself. "How are they doing?" he asked, watching as finished treating the last of the wounded. "They'll live," she replied, standing and stretching her forearms. "Though some of them will need weeks of therapy before they're ready to rejoin society. The psychological damage is often worse than the physical injuries." Nodded grimly. They had learned that lesson the hard way over the past 6 months. Rescuing slaves from their captors was only the first step. Helping them heal from the trauma of their experiences was often much more difficult. "Wants to see us in the briefing room," he said. "We've got intelligence on a new target." They made their way through the ship's corridors, past the expanded crew quarters that now housed nearly 100 beings from dozens of different species. The Underground Railroad had become a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where former slaves could find purpose in helping others escape the same fate they had endured. The briefing room was crowded with the senior staff of their operation. Sat at the head of the table, her weathered face grim as she studied the holographic display floating above the conference table. Beside her sat Commander, a former Imperial Navy officer who had defected after witnessing the atrocities committed by his own government. His tactical expertise had been invaluable in planning their raids. Doctor, a human who specialized in treating non-human species, had joined them 3 months ago after the railroad rescued her from a black market research facility. She brought with her extensive knowledge of alien physiology that had saved countless lives. "Ladies and," began, "we have a problem and an opportunity." The holographic display shifted to show a massive space station, larger and more heavily fortified than anything they had ever encountered. It bristled with defensive weapons and was surrounded by a fleet of escort vessels that could probably destroy half the core world's military forces. "This is Pandemonium," continued. "It's a mobile slave processing center that moves through the Outer Rim territories. Our intelligence suggests they're holding nearly 50,000 captives aboard that station." Commander highlighted various sections of the station on the display. The defensive grid includes military-grade shield generators and enough firepower to hold off a full Imperial fleet. Direct assault would be suicide, even if we could assemble every ship in our network. "So what are you suggesting?" asked Doctor. "That we just ignore 50,000 people who need our help?" "No," said quietly. All eyes turned to him as he studied the display with the calculating gaze of an experienced soldier. "We do what we've always done. We find another way." Leaned forward, her mind already working through the possibilities. "What do we know about their operations? How do they process that many slaves?" Pulled up another section of the display. "According to our sources, they sort captives by species and value. The most valuable ones are held in the central section under heavy guard. The rest are kept in massive cargo bays with minimal security." "Medical facilities?" asked. "Minimal. They're more interested in keeping their inventory alive than healthy. Most serious injuries just result in immediate disposal." Felt the familiar anger rising in her chest. 6 months of fighting this war had changed her in ways she never could have imagined. The gentle healer who had once flinched at the thought of violence had learned to channel her compassion into something harder and more dangerous. "They'll have medical staff," she said thoughtfully. "Even a facility that size needs doctors and nurses to prevent disease outbreaks, and they'll need supplies, equipment, medications." Caught on to her line of thinking immediately. A supply run, medical emergency that requires immediate assistance from qualified personnel. Smiled grimly. "I like it, but how do we get aboard without being detected?" Doctor spoke up. "I still have contacts in the medical supply industry, legitimate companies that service facilities like this, if we can intercept one of their shipments." "We'd need perfect documentation," Commander warned. "These aren't backwater pirates we're dealing with. Pandemonium is run by the Syndicate. They'll verify everything 3 times before they let anyone near their operation." "Leave the paperwork to me," said. "I know people who can forge documents that will fool even Syndicate security. The real challenge is getting close enough to make it work. Over the next 2 hours, they hammered out the details of what would be their most ambitious operation yet. Would go aboard Pandemonium disguised as a medical specialist, supposedly there to consult on a plague outbreak that was threatening their valuable inventory. And a small team would accompany her as security escorts, while and the Wandering Star would remain hidden nearby, ready to extract them when the mission was complete. It was dangerous beyond measure. If they were discovered, there would be no escape. The Syndicate didn't take prisoners, especially not ones who had been disrupting their operations for months. But 50,000 lives hung in the balance, and that made the risk worthwhile. 3 days later, they rendezvoused with a legitimate medical supply ship in the Vega system. The captain was an old friend of Doctor, who asked no questions when she requested a discreet favor. His cargo manifest was altered to include an emergency medical team, and the proper bribes were paid to ensure that customs officials would ignore any irregularities. Stood before the mirror in her quarters, adjusting the crisp white uniform of a senior medical officer. The identity documents identified her as Dr. Thane, a renowned specialist in xenobiology and infectious disease. The background was solid enough to withstand casual investigation, backed up by years of fabricated medical research that had been inserted into various databases. Appeared behind her reflection, wearing the dark armor of a private security contractor. His weapons were top of the line but not military grade, exactly what a medical team might carry for protection in dangerous areas. "Ready?" he asked. Nodded, though she could feel her hands trembling slightly. The fear never went away completely, but she had learned to use it, to let it sharpen her focus rather than paralyze her. "Remember," said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "we're not trying to free everyone at once. This is reconnaissance. We map the facility, identify key targets, and get out alive. The real rescue comes later." "I know," she replied, "but it's going to be hard to walk past all those cages and not try to help." "I know," said quietly, "but if we blow our cover trying to be heroes, those 50,000 people will never get another chance." The supply ship's approach to Pandemonium was routine and professional. The captain had done this run dozens of times before, and his casual familiarity with the station's procedures helped sell their cover story. When Syndicate security demanded to inspect the emergency medical team, the captain complained loudly about delays and potential contamination risks, playing his part perfectly. His first glimpse of Pandemonium's interior made her stomach turn. The station was a monument to cruelty, designed to process living beings like industrial cargo. Massive conveyor systems moved cages full of captives between different sections, while armed guards patrolled catwalks overhead. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and industrial disinfectant. The lighting was harsh and unforgiving, designed to break down the spirits of those trapped within. Speakers mounted throughout the facility broadcast a constant stream of propaganda in dozens of languages, promising rewards for cooperation and terrible punishments for resistance. Their Syndicate escort, a cybernetically enhanced human with dead eyes and a permanent sneer, led them through the main processing area without bothering to hide the station's true purpose. "We process about 1,000 units per day," he said casually, as if they were discussing cargo shipments rather than sentient beings. "Most go to the outer rim territories where labor regulations are more flexible." Forced herself to maintain her professional composure as they passed cage after cage of terrified captives. She saw beings from every corner of the galaxy. Vulcans with their proud bearing broken by months of captivity. Children who cried for parents they would never see again. Elderly who had given up all hope of rescue. But it was the humans that affected her most deeply. Her own species, reduced to cowering animals by the systematic cruelty of their captors. Some bore the marks of recent torture, while others had the blank expressions of those whose minds had finally snapped under the strain. The medical bay was their destination, a surprisingly well-equipped facility that could handle everything from minor injuries to major surgery. The staff was a mixture of legitimate doctors who had been blackmailed into service and former medical students who had been recruited from the criminal underground. Dr. Sarah, the facility's chief medical officer, was clearly one of the former. She greeted his team with obvious relief, her tired eyes lighting up at the prospect of competent assistance. "Thank the stars you're here," she said, leading them to a secure briefing room. We've got an outbreak of fever in Section 7, and it's spreading faster than we can contain it if it reaches the general population." "Fever," interrupted, his voice carefully neutral. "That's a biological weapon, isn't it?" Doctor's face went pale. "Officially, we're calling it a natural outbreak. But between you and me, I think someone in the syndicate decided to test a new bioweapon on expendable inventory." Felt sick. Using captive beings as test subjects for biological weapons was beyond even the horrors she had imagined. But it also gave her team the perfect cover for their real mission. "We'll need to examine the affected areas," she said, pulling out a medical scanner. "Map the contamination zones and identify potential vectors for transmission." Doctor nodded eagerly. "I can give you access to any section of the station. Just show your credentials to the security checkpoints and they'll let you through." Over the next several hours, and moved through pandemonium under the pretense of conducting a medical survey. They mapped guard rotations, identified key systems, and located the most vulnerable points in the station's defenses. The reality of what they found was worse than their worst fears. The 50,000 captives were just the beginning. Hidden in the deeper levels of the station were research laboratories where syndicate scientists conducted experiments that would have been illegal even during the darkest days of the old empire. They found children who had been subjected to genetic modification experiments, adults whose nervous systems had been rewired to make them more compliant, entire species being systematically broken down and rebuilt according to the twisted whims of their captors. But they also found something else, a resistance movement. It started with small signs that only someone looking for them would notice. Graffiti in dead languages that the guards couldn't read. Food distributions that followed patterns designed to maintain communication networks. Work assignments that seemed random but actually allowed trusted prisoners to move between different sections of the station. The resistance was led by an unlikely group, a former Imperial intelligence officer named who had been captured during a failed rescue mission, a Vulcan engineer named Ring who had been enslaved after her ship was captured by raiders, and a teenage human girl named Sarah who had spent 3 years organizing her fellow captives into an effective underground network. Made contact with them during a routine medical inspection of the maximum security wing. A coded message passed through a chain of trusted prisoners brought her to a hidden meeting space behind the station's water recycling systems. "You're not really here about the fever outbreak, are you?" asked without preamble. He was a tall, lean man with scars that told the story of months of interrogation and torture. "No," replied simply, "we're here to get you out." "All of us?" Ring asked, raising an eyebrow in that distinctively Vulcan expression of skepticism. "There are over 50,000 beings on this station." "All of you," confirmed, "though it's going to take time and careful planning." Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 17, but whose eyes held the hardness of someone who had seen too much, leaned forward eagerly. "We've been waiting for something like this," she said. "We have people in every section of the station. Guards who can be bribed, technicians who are sympathetic to our cause, even some of the medical staff who hate what they're being forced to do." Over the next hour, they shared intelligence and began forming a plan that was audacious beyond belief. The resistance would create diversions and disable key systems, while people used their access to the station's computer network to open every cell block simultaneously. But it would require perfect timing and more than a little luck. One mistake would result in a massacre that would make the fighting pits of Nexus Station look like a minor disagreement. As they prepared to return to their official duties, grabbed Sarm. "Why?" he asked. "Why risk everything for people you've never met?" Thought about that question for a moment, remembering the terror she had felt in her own cage what felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered stepping between her and certain death, choosing to risk his own life for someone he barely knew. "Because someone once did the same thing for me," she said simply, "and because it's the right thing to do." 3 hours later, the plan went into motion. It started with a power fluctuation in the station's main reactor, caused by Ring's careful manipulation of the engineering systems. As emergency crews rushed to investigate, Sarah's network of young prisoners began spreading rumors of an impending inspection by syndicate executives. The rumors caused guards to abandon their posts in the lower levels, gathering instead in the main corridors where they hoped to make a good impression on their superiors. Meanwhile, used his intelligence training to create false maintenance orders that sent security teams to investigate non-existent problems in distant sections of the station. At exactly 1400 hours station time, accessed the central computer system using her medical credentials and began uploading a virus that had developed during their journey. The program would systematically unlock every cell door on the station while simultaneously disabling the security cameras and communication systems. For a few precious minutes, everything went according to plan. Thousands of cell doors opened simultaneously. Captive beings who had given up all hope of freedom suddenly found themselves free to move. The resistance leaders began organizing the evacuation, directing people toward the escape pods and shuttle bays. But the Syndicate hadn't built their operation to be vulnerable to this kind of coordinated assault. Backup security systems activated automatically when the main network went down. Blast doors sealed off entire sections of the station, trapping thousands of newly freed prisoners. And the station's defensive fleet, alerted by the chaos, began moving to intercept any ships that tried to approach. His voice crackled over the emergency communicator. "We've got problems. The whole station's going into lockdown. We need to abort and get out of here before they trace this back to us." But looked around at the chaos surrounding them and knew she couldn't leave. Not with thousands of beings trapped behind those blast doors. Not with children crying for parents who were locked away in distant sections of the station. "No," she said firmly. "We finish this, all of them, we don't leave anyone behind." What happened next would become legend among the Underground Railroad. Dr. Thane, the quiet healer, revealed herself to be something far more dangerous, a leader who refused to accept defeat. Using her medical access codes, she began systematically overriding the blast door controls. When Syndicate security forces tried to stop her, the freed prisoners formed human shields around the computer terminals, protecting her while she worked. And his team fought running battles through the station corridors, buying time for the evacuation to continue. Brought the Wandering Star in close, her ship's weapons blazing as she dueled with Syndicate fighters. And in the end, when the smoke cleared and the last escape pod had launched into the safety of hyperspace, Pandemonium was a broken shell drifting dead in space. 50,000 beings had been freed, and the Syndicate's most profitable operation had been reduced to scrap metal and bitter memories. But the cost had been high. Was critically wounded, his body broken by the same courage that had saved life months earlier. As she worked frantically to keep him alive in the Wandering Star's medical bay, he looked up at her with those familiar, intelligent eyes. "Worth it?" he asked weakly. Looked through the viewport at the fleet of rescued ships, following them toward the safety of the core worlds. 50,000 beings who had been marked for slavery were now free to rebuild their lives. The galaxy's most notorious slave processing center had been destroyed, and the Underground Railroad had proven that even the most powerful criminal organizations were not immune to the power of organized resistance. "Yes," she said firmly, "it was worth it." As the fleet jumped into hyperspace, carrying its precious cargo of freed souls toward a brighter future, reflected on how much had changed since that day in the fighting pits. She had been prepared for agony, ready to die in despair and darkness. Instead, she had discovered something far more powerful than pain, the strength that comes from standing with others against injustice, the courage that grows when someone shows you that you are worth saving, the hope that survives even in the darkest places, waiting for someone brave enough to kindle it into flame. The war against slavery and cruelty would continue. There would always be more monsters to fight, more innocents to save. But they had proven something important that day, that compassion, properly organized and courageously applied, could overcome even the most entrenched evil. And in a galaxy that sometimes seemed consumed by darkness, that was a light worth fighting for.